I think the easiest way to think about Christian nationalism is this. To be a Christian and to be a proud American is not to be a Christian nationalist. There's nothing wrong with loving God and loving your country. Christian nationalism is the idea that because you love God, you get more of the country. And other people who don't love God or the right God or your God, they get less of the country because they are somehow deserving of less of it.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for this episode. My guest today is Dr. Bradley Onishi. He is a religious scholar. He is co-host of the podcast Straight White American Jesus. He is the author of Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next, and author of the forthcoming book, American Caesar, How Theocrats and Tech Lords Are Turning America into a Monarchy. Brad, thanks for joining me, and that's quite a subtitle.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's a lot, but there's a lot to cover.
Well, let me begin from a very general perspective. The kind of the thesis of hate comes to Main Street is this notion of what some people used to think of as white supremacy being a thing, a form of extremism, Christian nationalism being another form, and then QAnon being a third form of extremism. That, in current American political society, the three have become at times almost indistinguishable. Do, do you buy into that thesis?
I actually don't. I think that one of the ways we need to think about Christian nationalism is as on a spectrum, and this is how the folks at PRRI or Pew approach this. The folks at Brookings, scholars like Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry in their book "Taking America Back for God" put forth this paradigm. And I think the reason that a spectrum is helpful is it helps us to see things that we might not notice because we're always looking for extremists. So don't get me wrong. You are one of the people doing some of the best work out there, showing us how hate has come to Main Street. And when hate comes to Main Street in this country, as you cover extensively, that is white nationalists. It's white Christian nationalists, like folks in your backyard in Jackson County. It's folks who have a really conspiratorial worldviews that lead them to violence and radicalism, a la QAnon, Pizzagate, other things. But there are Christian nationalists who are at pews, sitting in pews on Sunday mornings, who don't score perhaps as militia members or as folks who speak in a way that the alarm bells go off and you think, oh my, this is a violent radical. Nonetheless, if you give them the survey, if you ask them the questions, they're going to tell you that the government should be based on biblical law. They're going to tell you that the government should declare this a Christian nation. They're going to tell you that the Bible should be taught in schools. Some of them are going to tell you only Christians should be able to be citizens. And so what I want is both. And I want people to see Christian nationalism as part of that mix of radicalism that you mentioned and extremism. But I also want people not to ignore the folks who appear to be normal and benign, who are sitting next to them in pews or with them at the school drop-off, who are willing to associate with or be part of cultures that are espousing some of that radicalism and that often will rub off on them when the chips are down. And so I think we need to get as nuanced of a picture as we can in order to fight back against these anti-democratic phenomena.
Yeah, I think one of the strengths of your book, Preparing for War, is that you come to the conversation from your own religious experience, from having come from a very conservative religious environment. And I share that with you. I come from a very conservative religious environment. And when Christian nationalism first came on my radar, I have to admit, I had the initial reaction of, okay, this is a bunch of progressives who just do not understand conservative religion. And I hear that from my viewers, from my readers who say, everything that you disagree with is Christian nationalists. Speak to those people who have that perspective. Why is Christian nationalism, why is white Christian nationalism a real thing, and we're not just deriding their personal views?
Yeah, so I was an evangelical minister for 10 years. I was somebody who was on track to plant churches. I have a seminary degree, so I come like you from this culture. I'm not somebody who's just observing. Additionally, my mom's side of the family comes from West Tennessee, and I used to live in Memphis, and so this is not somebody who lives on one of the coasts who's never sort of experienced these cultures and doesn't know how they work, trying to make sense of them or tell other people what to do. With all of that said, I think the easiest way to think about Christian nationalism is this: um, to be a Christian and to be a proud American is not to be a Christian nationalist. There's nothing wrong with loving God and loving your country. Christian nationalism is the idea that because you love God, you get more of the country. And other people who don't love God or the right God or your God, they get less of the country because they are somehow deserving of less of it. What the data shows us is that about 25 to 30% of Americans score as Christian nationalists in some way. And what might surprise people is that white Christians and black Christians score as Christian nationalists almost in equal numbers. However, when you ask folks on those surveys about things like white supremacy, things like police brutality, things like voting for Donald Trump no matter what happens, the black Christians who identify as Christian nationalists, they go a completely different way than their white counterparts. And what that tells us in survey after survey after survey is that when you identify as somebody who is a white Christian nationalist who believes this country was founded as a Christian nation and that the founders intended it to be for and by, governed for and by certain kinds of people, well, you get a worldview that's often implicated in white supremacy, in racism, in xenophobia, and so on and so on. And so I just want to make clear to everybody, uh, I don't think loving God and loving your country is a sin or is something we should be critical of. That's great. If you love God and you think that that gives you the right to have more of the country than anyone else, then I think you are a Christian nationalist. And then I think you are in the kind of realm where you believe that you're somehow more privileged or elevated above your fellow citizens. You want the government to privilege your religion. One of the ways I would put this is if we're all sitting around a round table and we have people of every race and ethnicity, every religion and non-religion, everyone from the American experiment sitting around. Somebody who is a white Christian stands up and says, look, it's great everyone's at the round table. I just need you to know I'm always going to get a higher seat than you all by dint of the fact of my religious identity. Well, I think we can see that as not just loving God and loving country, but saying I get more of the country than you. And I'm not really for democracy because I think I should get more of a vote or more of a say than you. That's what worries me about Christian nationalism more than anything.
And I think you and I have talked about that previously with Pastor Andrew Isker, who has moved here to Jackson County, Tennessee, and talking about Jews not having a seat at the table. That's a prime example of what you're talking about.
Andrew Isker and C.J. Engel both are willing to say that Jews don't fit the paradigm of Heritage America. That on the whole, that Jewish people don't fit into what they envision as Heritage America. And so, I think one of the things that people expect is for when we talk about Christian nationalism is for there to perhaps to be skepticism of or prejudice against people who are Muslim or people who are atheist and so on. I think what folks need to be aware of too is there is a deep suspicion and I would dare say prejudice against Jewish people coming from Christian nationalist spaces and characterizing them as unassimilable in the American political body. And so we've reached a place where anti-Semitism is an open ingredient in the recipe for Christian nationalism.
In fact, for those of us who follow this closely, there is a real division that's occurring right now in the Christian nationalist community between those who are essentially pro-Nazi and those who are anti-Nazi. And I'm not being hyperbolic about that.
You're not. And so, and I again, I think it's one of those, when you say that, there's people who are not following this as closely as you or I, who are thinking, come on, that can't really be true. When you dig into the writings, the podcasts of people like C.J. Engel and Andrew Isker, along with the folks that they pal around with, whether that's Joel Webbin or others from what I would call the extended universe of Doug Wilson. What you see is a division about Israel and the end times. And these new guard Christian nationalists do not see Israel as something that is special or uh, particularly protected or chosen by God. They believe that after Jesus, there's Christians and non-Christians. So in one sense, they're saying, look, the Jewish person in my theology is no different than the Hindu or Buddhist. They follow a false religion, quote unquote, or something like that. The the issue, though, doesn't stop there. They go further into open and really virulent anti-Semitism, seeing the Jewish person as a problem for the American electorate or an insidious force in our public square. And so all of the old tropes, all of the well-worn paths of anti-Semitism that were emblematized in the Third Reich now come to the fore. In addition, they often praise people like Carl Schmitt, the Nazi jurist who helped to build the Third Reich's kind of legal worldview. And so when you put those two together, you really do start to see a picture come into view that's like there are folks who think the Nazis were kind of really onto something in the foundations of their beliefs, and people in the Christian nationalist world saying, hey, we're willing to go pretty far, but we're not going to go that far.
The other thing I notice a lot these days is Christian nationalists do not talk about feeding the poor, caring for the sick, uh, welcoming the stranger. They don't spend a lot of time quoting Jesus.
Well, this is something we've talked about quite a bit in my work, and that is when you start paying attention, something really weird starts to happen. And that is that Christian nationalists love to quote Paul against Jesus, and they love to quote the Hebrew Bible, especially the war books, the books of ancient law. So that could be Leviticus or Exodus or Deuteronomy. That could be Joshua. And there's almost this sense of like, we've got to quote the Bible despite Jesus, because if we just quoted the Beatitudes, the entire Sermon on the Mount, the parables, we could not find the militaristic, xenophobic worldview that we want to uphold. And so quoting Jesus is often the last thing on their mind, except for when Jesus is like turning over the tables, in the temple or things like that. But for the most part, this is one of those fun games you can play. Listen to a Christian nationalist podcast. Take a drink of your Diet Coke there every time they mention Paul. Take a drink of your Diet Coke there every time they mention the Hebrew Bible, and then see how many times you drink when they mention Jesus. And I know how that game's going to end.
And I think, as you pointed out in a recent podcast, they talk about putting up the 10 Commandments in schools, but they don't talk about the Beatitudes.
James Tallarico is really good on this. James Tallarico, who's running for Senate in Texas, in the 10 Commandments fights in that state and the laws that propose to put the 10 Commandments up, Tallarico says, look, you could put up the story of the Good Samaritan. You could put up the Beatitudes. You could put up any number of scripture verses, and yet you want it to be the 10 Commandments. I think that's telling. I think that shows us what the goal is. The goal is not to win hearts and minds. As you said just a minute ago, the goal is not to help to feed the poor, protect the vulnerable, to take care of the sick, to welcome the stranger. The goal is to impose your worldview on others, to exclude those that will not get on board, and to make sure who has the cultural and political authority. And so when you have the 10 Commandments in your classroom, and you come from a family that is atheist or Hindu, Muslim or Buddhist, that tells you, I don't think I'm the right kind of American, and I might be doing something wrong because I'm a second grader and I've never heard of these. And I think that's the goal.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting that Stephen Wolfe, who wrote kind of the Christian Nationalist Bible, the case for Christian nationalism, makes it very clear that he's not relying on scripture to make his argument. He's relying on 16th and 17th century political thinkers. And so I think that's again another example of how the scriptures really don't play into this argument heavily.
I agree. It's concerning, and again, it's one of those moments where if you start to pay attention, you realize that the sources they are relying on are extra biblical. And I think for those listeners and readers who uh, have paid attention to Kristen Combes Dumay's book, Jesus and John Wayne, she makes the case that American Christian masculinity on the whole has been built on non-biblical sources. That could be John Wayne's films, that could be the film Braveheart, that could be MMA fighting, whatever it is. The point, though, is that what you're doing is creating a notion of gender roles, of masculinity, of foreign policy, and then trying to smuggle it in the Bible. My co-host says to launder it into the Bible so you can launder it out, right? You try to clean it through Scripture, just like you would clean dirty money. And once you start paying attention, you can see the trick they're trying to play there.
You have a book coming out later this year, American Caesar: How Theocrats and Tech Lords Are Turning America into a Monarchy. Now, that subtitle, some will accuse you of being hyperbolic in that case. What does that mean?
So, one thing I noticed going into the 2024 election is that the rhetoric coming from a number of different sources had escalated. So when I was an evangelical minister in the 90s and the early aughts, when I was part of that subculture, we talked a lot about swimming upstream in a culture that was no longer Christian by default, that we had to really show the world our Christian character and love. And we had to do that by winning people to Christ, through our witness. Um, And that really changed over the last 2 decades. Now the goal is to conquer and to colonize and to impose. And I started listening to Christians from Catholic spaces, from Protestant spaces, say over and over again, Christ is King, King Jesus. And on the surface, you might think, well, that's, it's biblical, King of Kings and all of that kind of business. But when I started to dig into the context, I started to realize something. They were saying, look, the United States is known for having one of the oldest democracies on the planet. It's known for a constitution and the separation of powers, the 3 branches of government. It's known for checks and balances. But there's a king of this country. You are somebody who lives under a monarchy. Doug Wilson, when he preached recently at the Pentagon at the invitation of Pete Hegseth, said that the nation had been purchased by the blood of Christ, that in essence, we are owned, we are purchased by God as a people. Again, there's theological explanations for that kind of language, but when you start to listen and pay attention closely, you realize what they're saying. You live under a monarchy. There is a king. You might think that this is about Congress and the judicial branch and the executive branch and all that stuff you've been taught about the American founding. You live under a monarchy. And the monarch is not here. He's in heaven. But I represent him. I'm the pastor, the theologian, the leader who represents him, and I know what he wants. So in his absence, I'm going to tell you. And one thing he doesn't like is democracy. The monarchy theme goes hand in hand with an open disdain for democracy. The Christian nationalist spaces have escalated to the point where they will say democracy is ruining the country. It has to go. It's not biblical. It's not okay. In addition, I noticed that same rhetoric coming from Silicon Valley, that there was this weird resonance between what obscure and well-known alike Christian nationalists were saying about democracy and monarchy and what Silicon Valley luminaries were saying about monarchy, that monarchy is good. Democracy is inefficient. Democracy is ruining the world. Democracy is the problem, not the solution. And I wanted to dig into the resonances between these 2 unlikely coalition partners. And so that is the main thesis of the book.
And that brings us to the podcasters that we've talked about who've moved to Jackson County, Tennessee, CJ Engel and Andrew Isker. They are not fans of democracy. And how do they fit into this book that's coming out later this year?
Yeah, so there's definitely quite a bit of material on Isker and Engel, and quite a few citations of you, Phil, and your work on them. And one of the things that I try to point out there is they openly think that democracy is the problem, not the solution to the country's woes. And they couple this with an ethno-nationalism that basically says, look, unless you're a white uh, Christian person, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or somebody whose roots go to Northern Europe, etc., there's really no way for you to be a real American. CJ Engel, almost daily on Twitter, as you know, Phil, calls for the deportation of 100 million people from this country. He doesn't want to just deport those who are not documented. If you are a South Asian person, if you are a person from El Salvador, who has El Salvadoran heritage but American citizenship, it doesn't matter your citizenship status. If you are not a European Christian, CJ Engel just thinks you need to go. You need to get out of this country for this country to flourish. So the disdain for democracy is coupled with an open ethno-nationalism that says there's no way for you to fit in here, and I'm going to do everything I can as a Christian to make sure you go. Now, this is coupled with an ease of welcoming violence. Andrew Isker says in his books, you have to learn what to hate. I mean, we talked about quoting Jesus. It's really hard to think about as a Christian the idea that would be a central pillar of my faith, learning what to hate. But that is what these guys teach. Ethno-nationalism, disdain for democracy, and a willingness to hate others and perhaps use violence in order to get the kind of country that you want. And so they are some of the most, to me, kind of emblematic figures of what I see as an escalation from Christian nationalism to something like Christian supremacy, Christian ethno-nationalism, something beyond what we might have seen 15 or 20 years ago when I was in the pews and in the pulpit in evangelical culture.
Last question for you. One of my subscribers on Substack, I asked those people, what do you want to come from this conversation? And the answer I got from a couple of people was, tell me what I can do. What would you say to those people?
I would say that we have a civic and a personal uh, 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 set of spheres that we can kind of think about as separate for these purposes. So I think on a civic level, we can show up to stand up for a multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. And you may be a Christian. You may be somebody who says, "Hey, I'm a white guy. I'm a Christian. Where do I fit in here?" And I would say, look, when you stand up to the policies, to the prejudice, to the pastors, to the others who would say, this country is only for white European Christians. Democracy is the devil. We need a dictator. When you stand up for that, you are standing up for the free exercise of your faith. Because one thing to keep in mind is when the government is able to be the facilitator of faith, when they decide who's the right kind of Christian, when Doug Wilson is allowed to preach at the Pentagon, but James Tallarico, a Christian, a seminary student, is not allowed to appear on Colbert's show. The government's now picking and choosing who's the good Christian and who's the bad Christian. And history shows us that at some point you will be in the category of bad Christian, bad American, not real citizen. So whether that is showing up at a protest, whether that is saying, I'm not going to be able to attend a church where folks are casually dropping these kinds of jokes or opinions, writing letters to congresspeople who openly tout this ideology, supporting organizations that are resisting policies that are filled with this kind of worldview. All of that matters. I am a firm believer that what has happened in the Twin Cities over the last couple of months is a story of an attempt to occupy a major American metropolis, and Christians and non-Christians banding together to say the power is with us, not you. We are different. We don't have the same customs or traditions. We don't have the same God in some cases, but we believe we all should have a chance to live freely, safely, securely, and that The only kind of true faith is when you are able to choose that faith for yourself rather than having it imposed on you. Wherever and however you can stand up for that. Protests, writing letters at your church, in your community, making sure that people are educated about the true ends and goals of some of the policies and laws that are out there. That is what you can do. And then on a personal level, there may be one or two people in your life that you have a close enough and safe enough bond with where you can have dialogues about these important things. And it's going to take a lot of patience and willingness to listen. But there may be an opening there for you to show them that you're not somebody who's a monster out there to spread quote unquote woke ideology and destroy their life. You're a human being like them who's scared and worried, who wants a future for their kids that is full of safety and security and a chance to flourish, a community that comes together and works together. Uh, if they can see that in you, they may listen to why you believe that the kinds of things we're talking about here today are actually really hurtful and hateful and that they're not the way forward. And so you may feel like you are one person and you can only do a little bit. But when all of us show up and do a little bit, you see what happens like in Minnesota, where there can be a powerful effect on the folks who are trying to take our basic rights away. And I think that's what's important right now.
Well, I thank you for your time. This is such an important conversation. Hopefully, it's a conversation that will expand. The new book, Bradley Onishi has a new book, American Caesar. People can pre-order right now. It comes out in the fall. Is that correct?
Yes.
But you can definitely pre-order now. So, thank you for your time, and hopefully we can continue this conversation later.
Anytime. Thanks so much for inviting me, Phil. Really appreciate it.